Hey everyone, we're going to be talking about photosynthesis, the way plants take carbon dioxide and water and energy from sunlight and turn it into sugar and feed the world. Plus they make oxygen as well. And it's going to relate back to cell respiration. So you remember what went on with making ATP. That's also part of photosynthesis. So we'll divide this into parts. So we'll call this photosynthesis number 1, since it's a pretty complex part or a process with a bunch of different parts to it. So how do I know when something does photosynthesis? I look for the green, right? Look for chlorophyll. So plants from the plant kingdom, certain protists such as algae from the protist kingdom, and then certain bacteria such as cyanobacteria, also called blue-green algae, can do photosynthesis. And if you can do photosynthesis, then you are called a producer or an autotroph. The rest of us are consumers or heterotrophs, and we rely on the producers to make that glucose and that oxygen for us. It basically takes care of all life on Earth. All right, so there's our equations. Let's see, if you're a heterotroph, this is the only one you can do. You take sugar, usually in the form of glucose. Can use other things as well, but basically gets broken down to glucose, and you want to take those hydrogens, right, and use them in the electron transport chain to make ATP. So we say glucose plus oxygen gives us carbon dioxide, water, and then ATP energy, and that's cell respiration. However, if you are a producer, then you can do both. You can do definitely the cell respiration thing, but the thing that all the rest of us rely on is your ability to do this one, photosynthesis, taking carbon dioxide out of the air. It just blows my mind. They take carbon dioxide out of the air, combine it with water and sunlight, and then they make sugar and oxygen out of it. It's amazing. These are, by the way, balanced equations for you. So what does it mean to be a plant? Well, you need to collect light energy and transform it into chemicals, which glucose. You need to be able to store light energy as well and store it in a stable form. It's glucose, right? And then glucose is kind of a base molecule. You can do a lot of things with it. You can chain it together to make bigger polysaccharides, bigger carbohydrate molecules out of it. And you can quickly break it down into its single glucose molecules and then use it for cell respiration. So it is a wonderful molecule, and with photosynthesis, then we can make glucose. Actually, there's a little thing that I'm going to have to talk to you about, that it's at the beginning, it's not actually glucose that they make. It's a 3-carbon sugar first, and then we get to glucose. But in the end, it's glucose. So it's all good. We need building blocks from the environment. So obviously bringing in carbon dioxide, and then also pulling from, like, the soil, magnesium and nitrogen. If you fertilize the soil, nitrogen and phosphorus are in that fertilizer. So you need these other things as well. And then this basically produces all the organic molecules needed for growth. And remember, all organic molecules have in common that they have carbon. So carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, which we've already studied. So we should know all about those molecules. So let's take a look at plant structure first of all. And so when we look at a plant, we're using, well, this is an interesting plant. We've got tomato on the top and potato on the bottom, right? Does such a plant exist? You'll have to look it up and find out. So we use our leaves to capture light energy. They're like big old solar panels receiving that light energy. And then you've got carbon dioxide that needs to enter the plant. So there are some little pores. They're called stomata or stomates. And that allows that carbon dioxide in, plus it allows gases to leave, like oxygen, after that's made in photosynthesis. We need water for this to happen, so that comes through the uptake in the roots. Because of the concentration of the roots, water will move by osmosis from the soil into the roots. Water potential, right? We've talked about that before this year. And then we need these other different atoms and minerals and things that we'll use. All right, and then getting deeper, go down to the microscopic level of plant tissue, and let's see what we find. So up here we have a leaf, and we cut a chunk out of it, and we do a side view, and we actually look at what makes up the plant tissue itself. And we see different cell layers, right? Just like we would have. We have different cell layers. So up at the top, we have what are called these guard cells, and they surround these pores. Those are the stomata, these little pores here, where gas exchange, carbon dioxide goes in and oxygen comes out. Gas exchange occurs. Transpiration occurs, though, as well. We have to watch out for that. That's when water is released into the atmosphere. Now, that can be good and bad. If the plant is trying to conserve water, it's going to want to keep these stomata closed. And the guard cells that are on both sides can close those up and contract and close. But if it's okay, if we're living in a rainforest, it's okay if we lose water. So those stomata can stay open. And whenever the stomata are open, that means that we're bringing in carbon dioxide, and we can do photosynthesis with that. Then we have other different cell layers. Going a little bit deeper, we see the vessel system, what they call a vascular system, called the xylem and the phloem. That's where different liquids run through there, as sugar, liquid, and water as well. And epidermis, that's like your own epidermis, the covering cells. A cuticle is like a waxy layer. And let's go deeper down yet into these pictures here. We can see the vascular bundle. That's the xylem and the phloem, where liquids go through. The spongy mesophyll, and other little chambers, and these chambers are going to come into play when we do our photosynthesis lab, because air can collect in these little chambers if it's not let out by the stomata. So that will be interesting when we do that part in the lab. Chloroplasts, there we go. Those are the organelle in the cells that contain chlorophyll. So those are important. That's where our photosynthesis is going to happen. So here we see another diagram on this side. We see gases coming in and out of the stomata. Like that. All right, so here's our definitions of the xylem. Transports water, and phloem transports sugar. So water goes up from the roots, and then since it's the leaves where you're making sugar, that goes down. So they're kind of opposites of each other. You got to transport things to all parts of the cell. So a vascular system is like vessels. Doctors will describe any place within you that has a lot of vessels. It's a very vascular area. Usually heals really fast, but places that don't have a lot of vessels takes a long time to heal. And so there's not a lot of blood flow, not a lot of traffic of liquids. That's why it takes a long time. Places like in your heel of your foot don't have a lot of vascular tissue. That's why those things might take a while to heal. But that's what we mean by vascular tissue. You get a little anatomy lesson, and it's cool that those things kind of apply both to humans and to plants as well. Oh, again, remember chloroplasts, organelle, where chlorophyll is. All right, there's our stomata, also called stomates. I've also seen them called stoma. These little cells here, they're kind of oblong shaped. They have the ability to contract and close up or dilate and open. Remember, gases are going to go through there, so it's good if we can bring carbon dioxide in because we can keep photosynthesis going. However, whenever the stomata are open, that also means water can escape through transpiration, so a plant could lose water. If it's in a desert, that would not be good because a plant can't afford to lose water if it lives in a desert. But if a plant lives in a rainforest where there is plenty of water already, then it's no big deal if those stomata stay open. And all right, let's take a look at the anatomy of the chloroplast itself. So this whole big chunk here, that's one chloroplast. So if we follow it down from the leaves, take a chunk out of the leaves, and then we see our little leaf cells and the little green dots within those leaf cells. We take those, and that's the chloroplasts. Now within the chloroplast, if I take a chunk off to peer inside there, I see some parts, and these parts are going to be important for for talking about photosynthesis. Now when you look at those parts inside, it kind of looks like a bunch of coins, green coins, stacked upon one another. They're little discs, right? And then around those discs then would kind of be a jelly layer. So it's kind of like a jelly roll. You would bite into this and there'd be this jelly surrounding these discs. Yum, right? And this is where the magic happens, or I should say the science happens, photosynthesis. Sunlight goes and hits the chlorophyll in these things, and then we're going to make sugar. But we'll get to that. Let's keep going and look at this a little bit more. Let's learn the parts of the chloroplasts. Chloroplasts kind of remind me of mitochondria. They've got a lot of membrane material. Remember, you got a lot of membrane, that means there's a lot of room for enzymes and things. So it's a double membrane, an inner and an outer membrane. The liquidy gel-like part, that's called the stroma. That surrounds all these little discs. Each disc then is called a thylakoid, and you see the thylakoids are stacked upon themselves, and so the actual stacks themselves are called grana. So all of these different stacks, that's actually plural. Many stacks of thylakoids are called grana. If you have only one stack of coins or one stack of thylakoids, then it would be a granum. So there's that word right there. So just plural is grana, singular stack is granum. One coin, one disc, that's called a thylakoid, and that's where the chlorophyll is. There's many different types of chlorophyll. Remember that. And wouldn't you know it, there's actually an electron transport chain inside these things. Yeah, and we are going to make some ATP in there. I know we're talking photosynthesis, but these plants, these producers are pretty remarkable in that not only are they going to make sugar and oxygen for us, they actually will be making ATP. They have to make ATP because it's their source of energy that's going to run one of the parts of photosynthesis. So they have to make this ATP in order to fulfill the whole process of making sugar and oxygen. So making ATP occurs in these thylakoids. And it's the same idea that you have to gather hydrogen protons in an area, and then you have to put, this is ATP synthase, remember that enzyme, the world's smallest turbine, the enzyme that spins. So if you put all your hydrogen protons in one area and they want to diffuse down their concentration gradient, chemiosmosis, right? You only give them one spot where they can flow down, and that's through ATP synthase. And then when ATP synthase spins, remember that it makes ATP. It puts the P on the ADP and makes ATP. So that's pretty remarkable that you get hydrogen built up in these thylakoids, and then you got ATP synthase just like we have, and you make it work to make ATP. Now, one of the questions, hopefully, I hope you're asking questions in your head while we're talking about this. Where do the hydrogens come from? In regular cell respiration, we know the hydrogens come from glucose, that you have to break glucose apart and transfer all those hydrogens to the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and then let them run down ATP synthase. So where do the hydrogens come from in photosynthesis? Because we're trying to make glucose. We don't want to use up our glucose to make more glucose. That just doesn't sound right. So where do the hydrogens come from? We're going to find that out in a little bit. You might be surprised. All right, with photosynthesis then, remember we are in the chloroplasts, and then inside the chloroplasts are the thylakoid discs. We're going to go there, and our first reactions are going to occur there. We call them the light reactions, since this is all done with sunlight, right? So that's what we mean by light reactions. These require sunlight, so it's often also called the light dependent reactions. These reactions will not happen unless we have sunlight in order to do it. So hence light reactions. And this is also going to be where we're going to make ATP, and we're going to build up some certain molecules that we're going to need in the end to make sugar. All right, so the light reactions here, if we look at this diagram up in the right upper hand corner, the light reactions are all about collecting light and using that light to make ATP, which is going to fuel this next part of the reactions to make sugar. But we're also going to have to generate some NADPHs as well. Does that sound familiar? I sure hope it does. So we're going to also generate some H's and NADPH so that we can deliver that as well to this second part called the Calvin cycle. All right, the penguin has this all scribbled out here. Back when I went to school, they called these the dark reactions, but people got it all messed up and were thinking, okay, these can only happen in the dark. But that's not true. The dark reactions can happen basically any time. It's just that they don't need sunlight out for them to happen. They can happen in the sunlight or when there's a cloudy day, either way. So if I ever call them the dark reactions, you know what I'm talking about. These days, they've been calling them the Calvin cycle, right? Named after someone, so you got to capitalize Calvin. I had a student named Kelvin a couple years ago. He was all tickled that this was named after him. Right? No, not named after him, a famous scientist. All right, and they also call it the light independent reactions, meaning it doesn't matter if it's dark or cloudy or sunny out, it can happen as long as the light reactions have been going on and we've made enough ATP and generated enough hydrogens for this to go on. All right, I should go back to say the light reactions, besides requiring light, will also require water. That's why you got to water your plants, everybody. You can't do photosynthesis without water. Water those plants, and then you're going to generate O2 from this. So then with the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions or the light independent reactions, this is where you're actually going to build your sugar. Now, usually we say this is where we're going to build glucose, but it'll actually be a 3-carbon sugar first, and eventually then the plant will make glucose out of it. Glucose, remember, is a 6-carbon sugar. So this is our summary to kind of keep us grounded as to what we're doing and which reactions are happening. I should also go back to say, look at what we need to do the Calvin cycle. Besides ATP and H's from the light reactions, we're also going to have to pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then we're going to generate sugar. All right, and here's in your notes, I gave you a bigger diagram of it, and if you needed to print that off and do notes around it, that would be all right. All right, so let's take a look a little more closely at the light reactions. So take a look up here in the picture. I've got this whole thing is a chloroplast. Then the green discs, remember, are thylakoids. So that's where our chlorophyll is and where we're going to generate H's and we're going to make ATP. Again, I'm still asking that question. Where do the H's come from? We're not going to break down glucose to get those H's. We're going to need it from somewhere else. We'll see if you can figure it out. But story goes, though, it's the electron transport chain that's going to be utilized here using ATP synthase to make ATP, and that can be used to generate sugar in the end. All right, we're going to use some similar players, I guess you could say, in us, the electron acceptors, or should we say the H carriers, was NAD and FAD. Remember those two? Photosynthesis does not have any FADs. Only NAD, but there's a phosphate group on the end of it, so we have to call it NADPH. It's just slightly different than the NADs that we find in our own mitochondria, but it's similar idea. It's an electron carrier, so its job is to grab onto H's and carry them to the Calvin cycle so that the plant can make sugar. Right? And so same enzyme ATP synthase. Oh, I like it when things are similar. There's a review of cell respiration, the mitochondria. You remember all that, how NAD gave up its H's here, that it got broken down glucose. FAD delivered them a little bit down the line, but then the electrons traveled along this electron transport chain, these enzymes here. And when the electrons traveled down this chain, it actually gave those enzymes energy to pump the H's up here. And then they could only flow down ATP synthase, which then spins, and then it's able to make ATP. Put the P back on ADP to make ATP. All right, that's our review. Cell respiration. It looks similar, yet a little bit different here with photosynthesis. So again, all right, we are in this whole big thing then is a chloroplast, but this disc, just this disc right here, I know it's not colored green. It should be. It's colored brown in this picture and white, but it's the thylakoid. And look at it, has a membrane around it, a phospholipid bilayer. I love that. And so outside of the thylakoid, remember, is the stroma, the liquidy gel-like part. So this thylakoid space here in thylakoid membrane, this is where we can find the enzymes that are going to do the light reactions. And the thylakoid space, the middle of the disc, that's where we're going to build up hydrogens. And then we're going to let them run down ATP synthase to make ATP. And both of our products here are going to go to the Calvin cycle. All right, and then over here, here's our other enzymes. These little teeny tiny green dots here, these are called photosystems. That's where our chlorophyll is at. That's where light is hitting. And we're going to take a look at what happens when light hits chlorophyll and how we're going to be able to generate electrons or H's from chlorophyll. Because we're going to need those. We're going to need the H's with their precious electrons attached to them, right? And we're going to need that ATP then during the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions, which actually happen in the stroma, in this jelly-like place. All right, going back here to take a look at ATP synthase, the ATP that evolution built, right? So photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis uses sunlight. Respiration breaks down glucose. Both of them involve moving electrons. So that's similar stuff there. Both of them run a pump. They pump protons. Those electrons pump protons, hydrogen protons to a certain place. It builds up a concentration gradient of protons. And then it makes them flow down, only one spot to flow down, and that's ATP synthase. So ATP synthase spins, which then it's able to bond a P or a phosphate group onto ADP to make ATP. Got to review that a lot. Now let's take a look at the pigments. Pigment is a protein, and the protein in question that we're talking about here is chlorophyll. There's many different types of pigments, therefore many different types of chlorophyll. Here we are talking about a couple called chlorophyll B and chlorophyll A. What do they have in common? Oh, they've got a lot of carbons, a lot of nitrogens, oxygens, hydrogens. They're organic molecules, right? Except the weird thing is that they all have a magnesium in the middle. That's weird. At least these two do. So you got to have some magnesium here to make some good quality chlorophyll. When you have a cluster of them together in the thylakoid, it's called a photosystem. And they're arranged in a certain way, and you'll see why. A little review of light, though, first, because photosynthesis takes sunlight. So, sun is throwing off a lot of radiation. Good thing we have an atmosphere that blocks a lot of it. Like, for instance, gamma rays. If those things made it through the atmosphere, they'd fry you. They'd fry your head. So gamma rays get reflected by our atmosphere, thank goodness. X-rays don't make it in. They're coming from the sun too. They don't make it in. UV light, some of it does make it in. And UV light is some high energy stuff coming off the sun. And when that hits your skin, it vibrates your molecules of your skin because of the high energy and can cause sunburn. And then eventually can wreck your DNA and can cause skin cancer in cells. So got to look out for that UV light. So notice these are all listed in nanometers. So these are wavelengths. So remember, light travels as a wave. Very teeny tiny wavelengths though. Nanometers are 10 to the negative 9. Teeny tiny wavelengths. High energy. Coming off the sun, by the way. And so it also travels as a little packet of energy as well, called a photon. So light is said to travel as a wave and a photon. If you take physics, you'll talk about that a little bit more. But it goes up and down like this. And these gamma waves, gamma rays, very high energy, teeny tiny wavelengths. But right in smack dab in the middle of the stuff coming off the sun is what we call the visible light spectrum. So these are the waves that your eyes have cells inside there to pick up. And at the different wavelengths, when your cells in your eyes, they're called cone cells, when they pick up something at about 380 nanometers, they see it as violet. When it comes in at about 500 nanometers, the cells see it, or I should say your brain sees it as a blue, green, all the way down to the longest part of the visible spectrum is red, about 700 to 750 nanometers long. So higher energy up here, lower energy, longer wavelength down there with the reds. If I go further down, I'll get infrared, microwaves, and then radio waves. And we make use of those radio waves to transmit signals on. So some of the sunlight stuff is pretty useful. All right, and then radio waves can be broken up into the AM radio waves and the FM radio waves if you really want to get into it a little bit more. This is the rainbow, and this is what our eyes and our brain can actually perceive as colors, which is pretty cool stuff, a lot of interesting things. If you have red-green color blindness, it means that you can't see the red and green part of the electromagnetic spectrum or the visible spectrum of light. All right, so this is just a little rundown of light, since light is used from the sun for photosynthesis. So now I might ask, well, what's the most important part of visible light that plants use from the sun for photosynthesis? Does a plant like the violet part? Does it use that? Does it like the blue part, the red part, the yellow, the green? What do you think? Well, on another note, basically the color that you see from an object is what's being reflected. And since we see plants as green, that means plants are reflecting the green part, this right here, and so they're not using the green like they're using the rest of the colors of the rainbow. Isn't that awesome? So that's why plants and producers tend to look green. Now there's other different types of chlorophylls and pigments that plants have that give them those other colors. Like I've got a tree in my backyard. It's a maple tree that has red leaves. So I know there's some red pigments in there, and so that's why I'm seeing it more as red. It's covering up the green chlorophyll, and I'm perceiving it mostly as red. All right, so photosynthesis gets energy by absorbing wavelengths of light. So that's what we mean by absorbing the wavelengths of light, particularly in this visible light spectrum, except the green. It's reflecting that off and not using it as much. In fact, we can do some graphs here and look at some graphs to kind of see the absorbance of light by chloroplast pigments. So absorbance means that it's absorbing that light and it's using it in the purples and the blues. It's really using that and absorbing it. But when you get to the greens and even part of the yellows there, it's not using it, it's not absorbing it as much, it's not using it. But get back to the reds again and oranges, then we bounce back up to absorbance, and so therefore we're using it more. Chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, other ones called carotenoids, they have just a little bit different absorbance, which is kind of good because that means it can kind of cover more angles, cover more of what you can absorb coming from sunlight. It's better to use more than one pigment absorbing sunlight so you can capture more of the different wavelengths. But one thing it seems like most of these pigments have in common is that they reflect green. So maybe we need to invent a plant pigment or a type of chlorophyll that can absorb green, right? Okay, let me know when you do that and give me a call when you do. So these different other pigments, chlorophyll A and B, very important. There's other accessory pigments, like also these xanthophylls, carotenoids. They help to ensure that you can get more light for photosynthesis, more absorbance. Ooh, that's a lot there, right? So here we see a photosystem. Look at that. So all of these are little discs of chlorophyll. All right, and light, a photon of light. That's a little energy packet of light coming from the sun, traveling as a wave, and it hits the chlorophyll down in the chloroplast, down in the thylakoid, right? It hits this chlorophyll, and what does it do whenever a photon hits chlorophyll? It makes the electrons bounce. It excites those electrons. Picture in your head a ring diagram of an atom, right? You got the nucleus in the middle with the protons and neutrons. Then on the outside, you've got the electrons going around, orbiting. When light hits that, it makes the electrons bounce. And that's what's happening here. And this is chlorophyll's job. This is amazing right here. Chlorophyll is an electron donor. Remember when we talk about electrons, we also got to talk about H's because it's the H's that carry those electrons. So chlorophyll is an electron or H donor. The electrons bounce. And well, you could just let them bounce, but that's not going to let you do anything. You want to grab those electrons because remember, grabbing electrons or grabbing H's gives you like money in the bank, gives you potential energy to use later. So chlorophyll's job is to provide electrons. When sun hits it, then the electrons bounce up. And then, well, there's got to be something to grab onto that electron when it bounces. And so if you're thinking in your head, electron carriers, right? NAD, like it carried it in us. Well, now it's NADP. It just has a phosphate group on it, but that's what grabs onto the electrons. All right, so again, I'm going to say it again. Chlorophyll's job is being an electron donor. Sunlight hits chlorophyll, It excites the electrons. They bounce around. So you got all these little pigments placed in kind of like a satellite dish is what it reminds me of. They're all placed in kind of like a satellite dish fashion so that all the electrons bounce around to the center area where you have an electron acceptor to grab onto those electrons to carry them to the Calvin cycle where we're going to make sugar. We're going to use those electrons. Remember, there's an H along with that. And we're going to use them to make sugar. So there's two different photosystems. So basically 2 different satellite dishes of chloroplasts. And they're called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Photosystem 2 happens first. I know that sounds confusing, but these were named in the order they were discovered. And unfortunately, nobody's gone back in to change the names. So photosystem 2 happens first, and it primarily has chlorophyll A, and then grabs on some electrons there. And then you've got photosystem 1, who primarily has chlorophyll B. Grab onto electrons as this is happening. So here's where they're placed. Here's photosystem 2. It happens first. Was discovered second, but it happens first. Light hits. There's a little satellite dish right in here. Satellite dish of chlorophyll. Sunlight is hitting it. An electron bounces off. You got to grab the electron, right? Electrons, actually. So then we pull those electrons and move them along an electron transport chain. And here's photosystem 1 down the line a little bit. It happens second. It was discovered first, but happened second. There's another little satellite dish of chlorophyll. The light hits it. Electrons bounce up. And then we've got to, again, move them along an electron transport chain. And there's our carrier there. NADP is going to grab onto the H's and become NADPH. It's going to carry that to the Calvin cycle. Because we need H's. We need H's in order to make glucose. All right. Well, there's another thing. Okay, well, let me go back 1 second. Remember the photosystem 2 had more chlorophyll A. Photosystem 1 has more chlorophyll B. And you have different types of chlorophyll. That way you can just absorb more of the sunlight, more of the spectrum, different wavelengths. All right. The other thing that I should mention is, or you might even be thinking, that you've got this chlorophyll here, and it all day long, sunlight is hitting it, and it's donating electrons, or H's. It keeps donating. Isn't it ever going to run out? What if it runs out of electrons, or H's? Oh my goodness. Well, that's why you better water your plants, folks, because we've got this other side job happening here. All right, I just changed my picture a little bit. We've got this side job happening where we've got an enzyme down here, and it's taking the water that you would water a plant with, or that it would bring up through its roots. It's taking and splitting that water. And basically, it's taking the H's and separating it from the O's. So this is where we regenerate our H's from. So these H's that come off water go back into this chlorophyll here. So that chlorophyll, as long as you keep watering your plant, is not going to run out of H's or electrons. You get those from splitting water. So these H's here go into the chlorophyll and replace the lost H's/electrons that was lost when sunlight hit it. Then you get oxygen. Guess where the oxygen goes from splitting water? Atmosphere, and then you breathe it. There you go. So now you know where oxygen comes from that you breathe. It comes from plants splitting water because they need to replace the electrons or H's that are lost from their chlorophyll when sunlight hits it. So that's, I thought, always an awesome thing to know. All right, so the H's then replace the lost ones in photosystem 2, which happens first. And actually, these electrons that come from here actually go over here in this one and replace the electrons lost over here. So really these H's on the end that we're talking about came from photosystem 1. And so the idea with photosystem 2 is that you take the H's with their electrons and use them to replace the ones lost over here in photosystem 1, and then the electrons with their H's that bounced up in photosystem 1, that's actually what goes on to the Calvin cycle. And meanwhile, we have an electron transport chain going on, right? So we can gather hydrogen protons down in this thylakoid space and make them run through ATP synthase, making ATP for the Calvin cycle, where we're going to make sugar. All right, so that's the rundown. We're going to do that again because I know it's kind of a complex process with a lot of parts and a lot of things going on. And this is just the light reactions, right? We still got to talk about the dark reactions or the light independent reactions or Calvin cycle yet. All right, so here we go. All right, as I click, the animations are going to take us through the light reactions. We've got our chlorophyll A, which is sitting in its little satellite dish formation, so that when sunlight hits it, this what's called photosystem 2, although it happens first, it was discovered second, remember? Sunlight hits that chlorophyll, gets the electrons all excited, and they bounce up. There they go. We bounce 2 of them up, actually. There's an acceptor who can grab those electrons, because otherwise they would just fall back down and go back into the chlorophyll atoms. We don't want that. We want those electrons. So a primary acceptor grabs them. Oh, I've got some more animations here. Meanwhile, remember that we're going to lose electrons all day while sunlight is hitting this chlorophyll. So we need to replace those electrons, and that's water's job. So you've got a little side job going on of water being split into its H's and its O's. So the electrons or the H's from water can go back into the chlorophyll and replace the ones that are lost. And then the oxygen is lost as oxygen gas, which we breathe. So that is so extremely important, because I don't know about you, but I like breathing. All right. Oh, I guess I get an animation over here. There's water being split into its hydrogens and oxygens. Inhale, baby. All right. I like that. So our electrons then can go to replace what's lost in the chlorophyll, and our hydrogens can go, oops, I'm in the way. Get me out of the way. Our hydrogen protons can go to the thylakoids, where they can be used to move through ATP synthase and make ATP. All right, so plants literally can be said to split water. Water your plants. Go home and water your plants right now. So that first splitting of water, it's just to fill the electron vacancy. Meanwhile, we're going to move those electrons. What this says here, cytochrome complex, that's just enzymes who are moving the electrons along, or an electron transport chain. So there they go. And then that pumps those hydrogen protons into the thylakoid space towards ATP synthase. So we can make ATP. There it goes. I like that. And then ATP will be used to help generate sugar in the Calvin cycle. All right, here goes our electrons. They'd be coming along here. Meanwhile, we've got sunlight hitting photosystem 1, who has chlorophyll B. And the electrons pop up. They get all excited and they pop up, bounce around, pop up. And remember, this chlorophyll here, this little satellite dish of chlorophyll, is losing electrons all day too. And so we need to replace the vacancy. So that's actually the job from photosystem 2's job, is to bounce up electrons to replace the ones in photosystem 1. And the electrons bouncing up from photosystem 1 are going to move along the electron transport chain here, just a short little one, where it's going to come into contact with NADP, who acts like NAD in us, and will grab onto those. There it goes, it grabs on and will carry those electrons along with the H's. Electron grabs onto the H, and then that'll go to the Calvin cycle. Remember, that's like money in the bank. Grabbing those electrons and H's, taking them to the Calvin cycle, and then you're going to be able to use those to do work with later. So that's all about the light reactions. Yeah, our job is to get some electrons or H's and get ATP. But we're going to need some things to do that. We're going to need sunlight, and we're going to need water because we have to have a replacement source of electrons from all the ones we're stealing from chlorophyll. Right? And then our products are also going to be, besides the H's, electrons and H's and the ATPs, we're also going to get oxygen, which we can breathe. I love it. So here we go. Now we're going to go to the Calvin cycle where we're going to make some sugar. Notice I haven't mentioned carbon dioxide yet because that's in the Calvin cycle. So here's a little summary of some interesting things here to sum it all up. The electron transport chain uses light energy to produce ATP and NADPH, which got that H with its electrons on the end there. Go to the Calvin cycle. Photosystem 2, it happens first, absorbs the light. The excited electron jumps up and passes from the chlorophyll to an acceptor. Grab onto it. Imagine throwing up a ball, and instead of letting it come back down and hit you in the face, somebody's up there and grabs it. It's got to replace that chlorophyll, the electrons lost, so we split water on the side, and oxygen gas comes off that. But then the hydrogen, the electron part, can go on the electron transport chain to replace the electrons lost in the other photosystem. And the hydrogens can be used to go through, or the hydrogen protons, I should say, can be used to go through ATP synthase to make ATP. So here's some questions. Where did all the O2 come from? Well, they always wondered that. Where does the O2 come from that plants release? And so if we look at the equation for photosynthesis, we see there's O in a few different places. There's O on carbon dioxide. Does it come from there? And then there's O on water. Does it come from there, or does it come from both places? So they did some experiments where they radioactively labeled the oxygen in water, and then they found it in the oxygen gas at the end of the photosynthesis experiment. So that pretty much told us the oxygen comes from water. But just to be sure, they tried it on the carbon dioxide as well. And if that would have been the case, then we would have found the radioactively labeled oxygen in glucose, but that's not where we found it. And so, or I should say that that it was found on the glucose, not in the oxygen gas. So there we go. We proved, although I don't like to say the word proved, but we proved that oxygen came from the water, not from carbon dioxide. So plants split water. The carbon dioxide, the carbon and the oxygen and carbon dioxide is going to go into glucose. If to give you a clue of what's going to happen in the Calvin cycle, look at the recipe for glucose. We need carbon and we need oxygen. All right, we got that in carbon dioxide, but we also need hydrogens, right? So that's what we just generated in the light reactions. We just generated not only ATP, but we generated electrons to put into glucose. This is what we generate when we're doing the light reactions. It's going to go into glucose, and we're going to get the CO2 from the air and combine that all together. And if everything's working great, non-cyclic photophosphorylation, what a word, right? If everything's working fine, we'll just keep it going, kind of like an assembly line like we see here, where we use sunlight photons to bounce up electrons from chlorophyll. And then an acceptor, there's the acceptor, grabs it, moves it along the electron transport chain to replace the ones here, but we've got more photons of light hitting photosystem 1, bouncing up electrons. This worker grabs it, puts it in the pail or the NADPH and grabs it. This is basically what's happened. And if light and everything is there, we just keep it moving and we don't back anything up. So I guess we could say photosystem 2 is what generates our ATP, because that's where we split water. And photosystem 1, which happens second, generates the H with its electron that's going to move on to the next phase. But sometimes some things happen. If things are kind of held up in the Kelvin cycle, if things are going on, maybe there's not enough carbon dioxide or something like that. If things are held up and this last electron can't get past to the NADPH, then we're going to have to kind of get things backed up a little bit. So this is where we call it cyclic photophosphorylation. So if we can't pass it on, this worker, instead of just standing there holding the electron, wondering when things are going to start back up again, can actually pass it back through the electron transport chains. And we can continue to make ATP. We can continue to split water all day, and we can continue photosystem 2 and making ATP. I mean, ATP is always good, right? So we keep passing our electrons backwards and keep that electron transport chain moving. That's not a big deal. We can keep making ATP that way. So it's called cyclic photophosphorylation when this happens. But in the end, we can't do this forever because we still need to make glucose. So hopefully the acceptors are going to allow this H to be passed on to the Kelvin cycle. But plants can do this, which is pretty awesome. Instead of just standing there and stopping everything, it's like, well, we can't make glucose, but hey, we can make ATP. Let's do it. So we can pass these back and keep our electron transport chains moving. After all, we do still need to make more ATP anyway, because as you're going to find out, making sugar in the Kelvin cycle is actually going to require more ATP, more energy, than it does the H's and electrons. Get my picture out of the way. It's going to require 18 ATP versus only 12 NADPHs. Oops, and all of that, I hit the button too fast, makes only 1 glucose. All right. I'm going to bounce through that, just like an electron bouncing. So here's all of our questions. You should be able to answer these now. So where does the energy come from? Sunlight, right? Where do the electrons come from? Chlorophyll. Where does the water come from? You, right? Rain, water in the soil from the roots. You water your plants. Where's the O2 come from? Water. Where's the O2 go? To you. You breathe it. To atmosphere. Where does the H pluses come from? Water, right? Breaking apart the H2O. Where's the ATP come from? Well, that comes from the electron transport chains near photosystem 2, which happens first. What's the ATP used for? It's used later to make sugar in the Kelvin cycle. Where did the NADPH come from? That came from photosystem 1, which happens second. And what will it be used for? Kelvin cycle, to make sugar. All right, stay tuned for the Kelvin cycle.